Okay, great. I think we started. So, hello to all of our listeners tuning in from all over the world. This is the third of our fourth Health Unlikely Conversation series, where we're bringing together someone, from the blockchain world, someone with planetary health experience, and someone with practical on-the-ground experience to be in conversation to find points of convergence or difference. So far, we've had such a rich and intriguing discussions from the previous two sessions. And if you're interested in hearing how those sessions went, feel free to look at the live recordings on our YouTube page, Planet.Health. So blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies have the potential to restructure global health financing and governance for the well-being of the population and the planet. This disruptive and innovative approach can help improve existing legacy systems currently being used and offer mechanisms to help solve or manage complex issues such as improving planetary health. Moreover, this reimagining of governance represents an important paradigm shift towards transforming global health to be more equitable, accessible, and efficient. There is potential in helping democratize systems through innovative governance. We are seeing an evolution in Web3 technology as we see the wider applications of Web3 beyond just cryptocurrencies, but moving more towards utility and mechanisms that can be used to leverage more complex issues such as supply chain, food insecurity, economic instability. This session aims to look at what adopting blockchain-based solutions can do to improve governance and decision-making between disparate groups. How does decentralization work? Is this a feasible mechanism for change? So this is our third of four unlikely conversations online and part of wider programs called Planet.Health. You can find out more at planethealth.club, including about attending our in-person event actually coming up this weekend. My name is Srivatsan Rajagopalan, and I'm a global health researcher and academic dialing in from London. I've always been interested in disruptive and innovative solutions that challenge existing legacy systems. I'm very excited to hear from our two panelists today, Professor Carmody Gray and Professor Jeremy Lauer. Now I'd like to hand it over to you both to introduce yourself. So Jeremy, if you'd like to start.
Thanks, Srivatsan. That's a great introduction. And, I'm already having a conversation in my head, a big old talk. I actually come from the World Health Organization. So, kind of in the global health sphere, where I worked for 25 years as, my title was economist, but I was doing a lot of different things, from sort of global health diplomacy to, crunching numbers and statistics. But, what we saw in those 25 years, right, is massive transformation of the global health space, with the entry of new institutions like the Global Fund, like UNITAID, like Gavi, like PEPFAR, like the President's Malaria Initiative, to talk about big bilateral or multilateral kind of institutions. And this has kind of, as I say, transformed the global health space, transformed what we're able to do, and really put WHO, in a sense, where I was working, on its back foot to try to figure out, wait a second, what is our role? So, I think there's a ton of stuff to talk there about governance at the central level, at the international level, but particularly also just picking up what you mentioned, which is, what is decentralized governance? And I'm sure Carmody has some thoughts about that as well, so I'll pass over to her.
So thank you both. Thank you, Srivatsan, particularly for that very good introduction to our conversation today. It's really great to be here, and I particularly value the chance to talk across disciplines. It's a bit of a cliche now that we need interdisciplinary thinking, but in my experience, that's often more of a slogan than it is a practice, and particularly the effort to just boldly step out and see what kinds of kind of cross-fertilization can happen, particularly in unexpected or sort of new and untested fields, I think is incredibly valuable, especially when the pace of change is so quick and we really need as many different angles and as many different disciplinary tools as we can have. So I teach in a theology and religion department, but my specialisms really are philosophy and ethics around science and technology and nature. And I work a lot at the moment on climate and ecological collapse and issues at the kind of intersection between values and policy, trying to bring practice. I don't really like this way of putting it, but I haven't found a better one yet. Trying to bring practice and theory, or if you like, action and principle together from for everybody, both for the practitioners and for the theorists. A word about health before we get on to the technology stuff. I'm kind of have been working for a while, very informally, on the thesis that health occupies the space that religion used to occupy at a global level. Wow. Health is the thing, health is the kind of narrative around which people can actually coalesce. It's the place where ethics comes home to roost, really. And it's a space which is increasingly institutionalized as well, in a way that never ever used to be the case. And that creates all kinds of fresh and interesting questions about the value of health, about what health is, about who gets to say what health is and for whom. And that's without even starting on the intersections with other aspects of global governance in relation to things like climate and ecology, which obviously overlap with, but aren't coterminous with questions of health. So I think this is a really important area, and obviously the specific technologies we'll be talking today are hugely relevant to that. So, so thanks for having me. And just to offer my very sincere apologies, I have to leave a bit early this evening, but I'm hoping that we'll have as much conversation as possible before then.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. And as you both said, this is such a transformative space. Health is in a different position now, and it's constantly evolving as we understand the complexities of the interaction between the environment, things like climate change, like you mentioned, and its impact on health and population. So just, on the topic of governance, Jeremy, what does governance mean to you? And, how does governance and financing come together, for example?
So, I mean, I kind of start from the view that, governance is more than government, right? That it's more than what the state does. And that, in fact, if you really peel back the layers, what you're getting at with governance is, how do we link together as human beings? How do we link ourselves together around common objectives with common values? And importantly, how do we, in those links, build common knowledge that kind of becomes, like for us, the operating system that we use in those linked groups? So, if I think about decentralized governance, WHO, where I spent 25 years, is super centralized, right? And, it aims to be the World Health Organization. So, and I love that. I love that institution. I learned so much when I was there. But in a way, my learning accelerated when I left, because I could start to synthesize and integrate my experiences. And I think if we think about decentralized governance, we kind of have to look at the building blocks. What are existing mechanisms of decentralized governance? And, we're looking at things like, obviously, families and friendships and clubs and, religious associations, to really, for the vast part of human history, communities have been governed by religious values and religious precepts. So, but if we look at really at the decentralized level, I think the family, is an interesting metaphor, or a friendship, or friendship groups, for thinking about how does decentralized governance work. Now, I'll just make one more comment and I'll stop. When you think about traditional IRL, in real life mechanisms for decentralized governance, they depend on a couple of things. They depend on like physical proximity. They depend on geographical proximity. They depend on maybe, like a shared language and culture, which are part of that operating system that we use. And what happens when you transfer that to the internet, before we talk about blockchain, let's just talk about something that we're a little bit more familiar with, maybe not that much, but the internet is still relatively new. When we transfer that to the internet, what we have all of a sudden is we have mechanisms for selecting and assorting ourselves and matching ourselves and affiliating ourselves that don't depend on geographical and physical proximity or on, like family ties, but they depend on values, presumably. So I think that opens up, really, like, I don't actually care that much about the technology per se. The tech stack might be interesting, but what's interesting is what it does for human beings in their lives.
Wow, that was really interesting, Jeremy. I think, your opinion on governance and, giving an anecdote or in a form of family and friendship is a very interesting way of looking at decentralization. I did notice that we have our third panelist, Primavera, who has joined us. Thank you so much for joining. And I was just going to give you a quick opportunity to just introduce yourself and, give us a little bit of information about who you are and your journey, working with blockchain and law and all the impressive things you've done so far in your career.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for being a bit late. Yeah, so I guess institutionally, I'm a legal scholar, and I'm working at the CNRS in Paris and at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. It's been pretty much now since 2014, so quite many years that my research is focusing on the legal challenges and new opportunities, especially with regard to governance of blockchain technologies. And and I think I have been trying, so beyond my academic work, I've been trying quite for many years now also to explore what are those new governance structures that exist with blockchain technology, and how we can apply them in various domains, and the domains that I deeply care about, which are both environment and science. As many people are aware, it took a while actually before blockchain communities actually started looking at those questions. But now, like with the rise of refi and DeSci and so forth, like it's actually very interesting. There's somehow a new adoption, a new wave of adoption of blockchain technology by new communities that are trying to take the same principles that usually were to be applied more on financial application, DeFi, and so forth, into those new domains. And this is kind of like my main interest as well, is like how the technology, which is pretty much just a technology, but how the affordances of this technology enable things that were not necessarily impossible to do before, but that were much more difficult or simply not as salient. I mean, decentralized science, you don't need a blockchain to do decentralized science for sure, right? And yet, we've been talking about decentralized science for a while, but we never managed to have a movement around it. And all of a sudden, the blockchain is bringing this movement around it. Regenerative finance, same thing, right? Like, so I don't think we need to also like praise the blockchain per being this amazing technology that is making possible the impossible. But I think it becomes very interesting to leverage it where it actually does make sense to leverage, and trying to steward it in the direction that we think is the most interesting one.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I do agree with you. And, I feel like sometimes when there's a lot of hype around technology, for example, blockchain, it's very easy to be like, this is our magic bullet, this can solve all the problems. But, you know, we also have to ask ourselves the question of, you know, is this technology actually useful? Will it add value? Will it improve access, equity in this specific scenario or for these specific solutions? And we can't, you know, blindly accept it because it's novel, it's hype. So I really think that's a interesting way of looking at it. And like you did touch upon principles, and that's something we discussed in our first session about applying those principles rather than the focus on the technology. It's that decentralization that we're looking at, and this is kind of a vehicle for that sort of movement. Just, you know, Carmody, you're a theologian, but you also consider what gives humans meaning and purpose. In that context, you know, what is governance for you?
It's a great question. And thank you both, Jeremy and Primavera, for very, very, very interesting perspectives. So interesting to hear from you, Primavera. There's a technical levels there that I've just never seriously thought about, and it's really great to have that. The sheer technical challenge of governance of these technologies is such an interesting one. But drawing back, I mean, it's overquoted, but it's overquoted for a reason. You know, the earliest significant work of political philosophy that we have is Aristotle's, and he famously says man is a political animal. We can translate that to humans are political animals, women as well as men. Of course, unfortunately, because that thought has been mediated to us through Machiavelli, we tend to think that Aristotle was saying something bad. You know, that we naturally are maneuverers, human beings, or that we're naturally cunning or something like that. And of course, Aristotle didn't mean anything of the sort. He meant something much more like what Thomas Aquinas would have said, or indeed, and it's just an accident that I'm quoting Catholics at the moment because I could be quoting people from other faiths, right? But also John Paul II, best summarized, I think. John Paul II said there simply is no such thing as a person alone. We just aren't persons by ourselves. Yeah. And that's not supposed to be like, he's not proving a point. It's supposed to be like a mere description. What makes us a person is actually relationship. Governance, and Aristotle saw this, right? And it's been mediated to us through all kinds of different strands in the Western tradition. Aristotle saw that human meaning and purpose actually is in the way that we relate to others and to the world around us. And because of the kinds of intelligence that human beings have, we naturally do that in an organized way. Yeah. And that's basically all governance is, in a sense, right? It's organizing around common purposes and organizing ourselves to achieve common purposes. And I find it very troubling. There's so much to say here, and I'm going to try to not go on, but I find it very troubling that we live in a time both when institutions are very fragile, and that includes both institutions of government and institutions of civil society, which Jeremy mentioned. And at the same time, they're fragile and they're objects of severe criticism. The word institutional is almost like a pejorative term now. You know, if people say they don't like, quote, institutional religion, you know, the thing they don't like is the institutional bit. And people are very negative about institutions of government. And the institutions of civil society are all but falling apart. And that's very troubling, because that really represents a way of thinking about human beings as primarily monads. Yeah. And entering into relationships only from that place of being a monad. You know, and maybe as this monad who is me, which is me, the kind of Descartes, right? Like me inside my head. From that place, I enter into relationships with other people. And that's not how it is. I really don't think that's how it is. You know, I'm not in here and then I come into relationship with you. I'm in relationship with you from the moment that I exist. And only through that, in that space between us, do I become a full human being. So that sounds all very theoretical, but of course it's anything but theoretical. It's to do with how we actually live together. And coming, you know, closer to practice in terms of the meaning of governance, I think that, and Jeremy used this language, which I think is absolutely the right direction to go in. It's really about the common good. You know, the goal and meaning of governance is simply the idea that there is something that is good for all of us, that what's good for me really is good for you, and vice versa. And there may be conflicts at certain levels, but ultimately we're a human family, right? And governance is how we get ourselves to act together to bring about that common good. And final thought before I hand back over to you, Srivatsan, the final thought, just to introduce a concept that may be helpful in this conversation. Some of you may have come across this before. It's taken from Catholic, so what's called Catholic social teaching. That's a bit of a technical term, but it just means a tradition of Christian reflection about society, right? Going back to the beginning and it folding a lot of Aristotle in. Subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is simply the idea that we should only be as centralized as we actually need to be in order to protect the common good. So decisions should be made. I'll just spell this out in case some people here don't know what subsidiarity means. It's a complicated word for a very simple idea. It simply means the decisions should be made as close to as possible to the level at which they will take effect, whenever those decisions can still be effective at that level. So decisions should only be, if you like, evolved upwards through chains of governance to the extent that they have to be in order to protect the common good. And that, I think, is a helpful way of answering the question, how centralized do we need to be in any given instance? Because we do need some central processes. The question is how centralized and for whom and at what levels? And I think subsidiarity is a really helpful concept for negotiating that question about centralization and decentralization of the spectrum, you know, from one to the other.
Wow, I think that was really interesting, and I love the way you framed it and talked about, you know, that little aspect of how much centralizing we need. And I think it's quite incredible to hear these perspectives from you three on governance, and you know, just to kind of understand points of convergence between, you know, for example, blockchain and governance to come together to support, you know, human and planetary flourishing. I would like to go to you, Jeremy. You know, you mentioned working for the WHO for 25 years. You know, how did governance function there? And, you know, where, in your opinion, did that fall short? As you did mention, you know, there were some things about it that, you know, might have gone against what we're trying to do. So in your opinion, what do you think that was?
Well, I mean, speaking about institutions and picking up a couple of Carmody's points, first of all, there's just so much in what you said, Carmody, that is like just, you know, we could have seminars and seminars. And really quickly, you know, Aristotle, who wrote about politics and said man is a political animal, also wrote about friendship prominently, right? And he also wrote a book, and maybe it was in the Nicomachean Ethics, you know, that he gave the title of his friend to his book about ethics. You know, he named his friend in the title, so to speak. So, you know, there's something very, you know, when we think about Aristotle and politics, we should also be thinking, I think, about friendship and love of a Platonic kind, let's say, and how that operates in society, you know, how that binds people together. Now, institutions, building again off of your thoughts, Carmody, institutions have certainly become weaker. And I'll link that to WHO in a second. But what I tend to think has become weaker is not so much, well, certainly not the bricks and mortar. And, you know, in many cases, like the constitution of WHO is still the same as it was in 1946, you know, so like the rules of the game haven't explicitly changed. But what has changed? I think our common knowledge, the operating system that we use about the public good and the common good has become challenged, contestable, vitiated, etiolated, diluted. And as a result, institutions fail. So it's really not like about more checks and balances or, you know, like, I mean, I think it's great that the UK has like an anti-slavery policy that every company in the UK has to, you know, depose as a part of its registration. But there is this sense sometimes, and I will call out the UK on this, that, you know, that it's really about a checklist, right? And I think this is not about checklists. It's actually about, you know, it's not about ticking the boxes. It's not about environmental sustainability and governance checklists, you know, to greenwash, you know, what ExxonMobil is doing. It's actually about building common knowledge, and that common knowledge transforms, and, you know, it can be like, we can get like sort of a weak shadow of that written down on paper as constitutions and in laws. I'm super interested in law, and, you know, there's that old statement that code is law, that we could debate. But I think what the issue is with WHO, to come back to your question, Srivatsan, is it only contemplates member states, nation states, as members, as actors, and probably, baked into the bread of WHO was a desire to put the spotlight on member states, right? I mean, there's a fascinating story about how WHO got started. The UK, France, United States didn't want it, at the Conference of International Organizations in San Francisco. And it happened because of three countries: Taiwan, which has observer status, not a member, Brazil, and I want to say Netherlands, right? I'm not 100% sure. And WHO got started as a result, but there must have been like serious breaks put in around the prerogatives of member states and guarding the sovereignty of member states. So where WHO falls short, I mean, it has beautiful knowledge, we have beautiful policy, but there's absolutely no mechanism to put that policy into effect. When we got the Global Fund, when we got Gavi, when we got the Clinton Foundation, when we got PEPFAR, when we got Unitaid, what did they do? They started to link policy to mechanisms, to procurement, to supply chain, and to delivery platforms. And when you can do that, I mean, those are like really broad brush connections, right? We started this talking about connections. Those are really broad brush connections, and they don't really, I don't think anybody's going to like live or die for like procurement and supply chain solutions, right? But what they managed to do was to link policy to mechanisms that connected them. And the Global Fund, importantly, the most important innovation it did was it introduced the country coordinating mechanism, which meant that you had to involve civil society and a broad range of stakeholders before you get a Global Fund grant. WHO could sit there and say, our partners are the ministries of health. The World Bank can sit there and say, we deal with elected governments. The Global Fund said, we deal with societies and cultures and stakeholders and people. And as a result, we went from coverage levels of antiretroviral therapy when you had 60 regimens in Switzerland. You had global coverage levels of effectively 0%. Now Africa has a higher coverage rate with ARTs, antiretroviral therapies, than the rest of the world. There is no way that would have happened without Global Fund and PEPFAR. And that means that something happened, that until we rolled out a COVID vaccine, and one of the questions that came in on the chat was about COVID, until we rolled out a COVID vaccine in 2 years and blah, 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 and all those things we did to vaccinate billions of people, the world had never seen a transformation in coverage with effective therapies that save lives happen at such a pace. And it happened for $50 billion. We spent $22 trillion on COVID, trying to close the barn door after the horse has left. And we still don't have the horse back in the barn, right? Obviously not. So for $50 billion, tiny amount of money connected to mechanisms, you can change the world. So where I think WHO, goes wrong is in not, like when I worked at WHO, we kind of think of the Global Fund as our competitor. They're actually the best thing that ever happened in our space, as imperfect, as colonialist, and as, sort of like colonialism by remote control, very, very strongly controlled. Like in some sense, like as imperfect as it is, amazing good things were still able to happen. Thanks for that. Over.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Just to pick up on some of your points, I think, you didn't mention that kind of gap between like policy and practice, similar to what Carmody said. And this idea of becoming more people-centric. I feel like, when you look at institutions, a lot of times they lose focus of actually who are the beneficiaries of all these policies, of all these interventions. It's the people. So I think those are really interesting points. Just moving on to Carmody, your work also considers nature and ecological and climate crises. How is governance failing on this front?
Yeah. I mean, I think when political historians of the future write the history of this time, they will identify it as the ultimate imaginable failure of governance. I mean, insofar as the purpose of governance is precisely to help us to organize ourselves around common goods, that it's hard to imagine a greater failure. And in a sense, I don't want to be too harsh about this. The fact is that humanity doesn't really have the instruments for handling common goods at the global level of this nature. So it's not that we kind of knew how to do it and we haven't done it. It's kind of a totally fresh, out of the dazzling blue challenge for us. To be able to have a governance of humanity. And that is, I'm afraid, exactly what's required if the globe is starting to behave, if you like a single organism. And I don't mean that, I'm not talking about kind of religious or spiritual interpretations of the earth here. I'm talking about the fact that the climate is a single system, it's a planetary system. And in that sense, it's the ultimate common good. And lots of environmental philosophers, of course, are now identifying that climate is the ultimate example of a common good. It's a good that we really, really, really do all have in common. I think that Jeremy's point is terribly, terribly significant, that there is a real etiolation of the civil institutions in which we talk about and frame what the common good is and how we want to frame and pursue that. And that's not incidental. Like, although it's true that we have this global governance problem, it's a serious undermining of that global governance if the functions of civil society aren't supporting.
Oops. Oh, that's a shame.
Oh no. I unfortunately think she had a connection issue. I hope she can join us soon. Just, to keep this amazing conversation going, Primavera, as someone who works so deeply in blockchain and, given what you've heard, how can blockchain support the change to make governance work for people on planet? You did say that this technology has its limits. It's not the, magic bullet, but how could it be a platform that enables this sort of change within people on planet?
I think you're muted, Primavera.
Excuse me. Yeah, maybe I can speak more to the institutional side of things, because I think whatever we are seeing today in terms of institutional governance and institutional solutions, different institutions are trying to adopt different mechanisms, but there is always this, especially when we look at the private companies patent race towards finding a cure to whatever is the most profitable to find a cure for. And so there is this very institutional and competitive in some way approach, because, we need to get a patent and let's invest all the money we can to get this patent so that then we get royalties, etc. So the usual model. What becomes interesting when we move into an institutional approach, and blockchain technology is actually a very useful tool to support these alternative modalities, which is we don't think per institution anymore. We actually think per what's the mission, what's the project, right? And somehow, instead of creating a new institution that will then collect money and invest this money and compete with all the other institutions to be the first one, but maybe it's bigger, so it can run faster, let's transcend those institutional walls and let's actually create a mechanism in which anyone in the world, institutions, individuals, whoever, large international organizations can all contribute both financial resources, but also actual research resources, intellect, people, machines, and so forth, in order to collectively try to solve a common problem. And again, this is not something that the blockchain needs, but sorry, this is not something that needs the blockchain, but this is something that the blockchain can support, because when you eliminate the institutional framework, and somehow if you maintain this institutional framework, then you stay within the functioning of an institution, which by its own definition, because it is a closed box, engage into a competition between these institutions versus the other institutions. And so either you manage to create a large worldwide type of institution where competition is harder because it just takes everything underneath. But when we are, especially in the private sector, it's much more difficult. And so the blockchain becomes this scaffolding infrastructure that enables something that does not come with the same scaffolding that most institutions have, that nonetheless can have a bank account because it can hold crypto, can have a governance structure without needing a legal structure and bylaws, that can actually have automated contingencies and automated operations, that can also somehow retribute people with whatever type of tokens we can imagine. Anything becomes a possibility. And so all of a sudden, we start thinking no longer about what is it given the institutional framework in which I operate that I can or cannot do. We actually start thinking, okay, what is it that we want to do? And if we want to achieve this on a global scale by transnationally, right? We want to be able to gather all the people, all the researchers that actually will die to contribute collectively to our research, because all they care is actually finding the cure. They don't care that their institution gets a patent. And if they can do that, and in addition be rewarded for it, then of course they will contribute to that, right? And so all of a sudden, and I think that's where like applying blockchain technology to the DeSci world, we can enter worlds in which we don't even need to race for a patent, because actually what matters is not the patent. And imagine if actually you're telling the world, hey, help us contribute, and whatever we found, we're going to patent it on a defensive patent license, and we're going to make it available for the whole world. You can be sure that people are going to contribute, right? And so all of a sudden you can leverage a very, very large community of people that in some way it's kind of like it's the Wikipedia style model. There is a point, if there is enough gravitational force that is surrounding these initiatives, there is no possible way to compete. No rational private company will try to compete against that, because they cannot win the race, because this collective force will go, of course, much faster, because it has more people and it has more support, because there is a global network of people that are supporting it. So of course, the challenge is, how do we get to this gravitational force? Because it's not obvious. There needs to be credibility behind those initiatives. It's not enough to just say, hey, look at me, I'm gonna solve cancer, just send me money, right? And I think that's where there is something very valuable in drawing bridges between existing institutions which have the gravitas, which have the credibility, and those new mechanisms, those new modalities, so that the institution is doing what they are good to do, which is providing confidence and attestations about things, but then leveraging this new technology to actually like span across the world and collect all type of people and contribution in a completely institutional manner, and then pushing this thing forwards, right? And to me, and of course I'm very utopian when I envision the possible futures that this can lead to, but I think like if we have even like 1% of opportunity that this thing can work, it's ridiculous not to do our best to make it work.
Yeah, and I think it's quite amazing, and it's quite, cool to see how, you and Jeremy were talking about the same thing, about how we're all fighting towards a common cause, yet there's still competition. And it's more surprising in a context where people are trying to help each other. Your point about working in the WHO and the Global Fund created this solution, to help a lot of people, for example, in Africa, yet you felt like you're competing with them. Similarly, the way you said people are competing or racing to, find patents, make drugs that are make the most money rather than to aid the mission. And I think that's what's really special and what also excites me. I'm a young academic, and I always ask my funders, and I say, look, all three of us are trying to work on child health. Why can't we just work together, and won't that be more impactful? And they laughed at me and said that, that's not how it works. And I was like, why does it work like that? And why do we accept that it works like that? So that's really interesting. Leading on to my next question. So,
Is it possible, could I just link to a couple of those ideas, Srivatsan?
Yeah, for sure.
And, just try to bridge back also to what Primavera was saying. People that say that's not possible, what are they thinking about? What is their worldview? And it's very much the worldview that she referred to, that we are monads, we are atoms, right? That we're not collectives. And, so I think there's two great metaphors here. And for decentralized cooperation, like we actually have two massive examples of decentralized cooperation. And I don't even want to talk about like IRL, in real life ones like the family right now. What I want to say is, more reified and, theoretically studied. And one is the market, right? Where, everybody operates for their private profit. And the other, so what we see with the market is, we see a lot of the outcomes like we see with, the race to patent technologies and so on and so forth, which, a lot of like fruit is left hanging on the tree just because the incentives are structured in a certain way. Now, the reason I'm all in on blockchain, actually, I would probably use a slightly different term. I would use like mechanism design or Web3. And blockchain is kind of like our premier example of Web3. But the reason I'm all in is because the other great metaphor that's other than the market, and that actually is a giant factory for creating common goods, is the internet. The internet is not a mechanism it's a decentralized mechanism. It's decentralized and people can behave strategically. They don't have to, like willingly cooperate. But what gets produced there is common good after common good after common good. Whether it's the network infrastructure itself or the communities that blossom and flourish. And, we could talk about like the bad things of Web 2, that Facebook hoovers up your data, and I'm there with you. But, people still are on there every day because it helps them to create those kind of pluralities that they want to, create common knowledge and common goods within. So the internet, and I think we just have to actually like use our design thinking, and Primavera, I think that was a word that I heard you say. I might have gotten it wrong, and apologies if so. But we have to use our design thinking to think about how can we calibrate this giant machine for making common goods, such that it's actually organized around social good. So I'm thinking, you may even be some of your colleagues, Primavera. I sat in on a group called Mechanism Design for Social Good, the Algorithm, Law, and Policy Working Group. And we had a lot of people from Sciences Po and, Sciences Po basically, and CNRS. There was one person, I think, that has CNRS affiliation. That are in the law. They're talking about law, right? But they're talking about sort of the algorithmic side of law, if you like. So, I think it really comes like we have this metaphor. It is not, people talk about the internet as a market, but that's a red herring. The internet is a factory for common goods. And we just have to like tweak that. And I think blockchain is a great example of how, basically taking the, making like that read and write library of Web 2.0 and giving the ownership of the data and the information, and more importantly, the knowledge, which is capitalized data and information, back to the creators and getting the value of that back to them. One of our premier examples, probably the only success story we have so far, is blockchain. And, you know, like Bitcoin is interesting. It's a fascinating technology, but it's a transaction ledger. When we start to get more interesting is when we talk about distributed state machines, right? Where you can build on that ledger any kind of contract that you can write in words or in code. And, you know, so Ethereum, you know, is designed that way. I'm not saying that they've solved all the problems of that. I'm not like I'm pretty far down the road of like proof of stake versus proof of work, but, you know, like I'm still pretty agnostic, to be honest. But what I find interesting about Ethereum is that it takes the idea of a ledger and it makes it, you know, you can write anything you want to into that smart contract, really. And, you know, so people are doing some really interesting stuff with that. And then it becomes much more about what human beings care about. Yeah, we do care about transactions, and having a public ledger of transactions is great because then the transaction layer is a public good. But, you know, we care about a lot more. So I'm thinking about, you know, that's a fantastic example of innovation in the Web3 space that, you know, can push us toward, you know, realizing the promise that Primavera is saying. You know, maybe it's idealistic, but if we even have a tiny small chance, we've got to go there, because you know what? The people whose job it is to go there have abdicated. Like the people we've elected to go there to do that on our behalf have abdicated 100% on climate, for example, as Carmody was saying. Over.
That's really interesting, Jeremy. I really appreciate you expanding on your thoughts. And I think, you know, connecting to what Primavera said, I think these are such important considerations about the potential of taking ownership of your own data, taking ownership of your own things that have been capitalized. And I really like your viewpoint of internet being, you know, that facilitated for goods, for action. And I think Web3 is that natural progression where it's coming back to the people who provide this data. And it's very interesting. So Primavera, you know, for example, with blockchain, we have things like DAOs. Could you give a simple explanation and touch upon how they can facilitate mechanisms to aid governance? And, you know, following up on that, I feel like, as you touched upon earlier, you said that initially there was a lot of technologists who were focused on blockchain, but suddenly, you know, more people are getting interested. For example, we're looking at these applications, more refi, DeFi are coming up, but what needs to happen to facilitate that wider adoption of these type of Web3 solutions?
Yeah, so just before I answer that question, maybe I just wanted to add something to what Jeremy was saying. I think because there is a lot of different facets of blockchain technology that I think can be very useful to dig into when we think about, I guess, health or desire more generally. So there's like, of course, the tokenization system, which the cryptocurrency tokens, etc., which we are all very aware of. And then there is the smart contract aspect, which is also like, how do we create system that there is some kind of guarantee of execution and we can increase the confidence in the way in which those things operate, which is also great. I just wanted to add one before we go into the DAO, which is the certification or the tamper-resistant registries, which is actually extremely useful. It's almost like too simple, so it's not as exciting, but it's extremely useful. The possibility of actually creating mechanism of decentralized or distributed certification, distributed attestations, but also like the provability, the ex post provability. So for instance, like if I'm a pharmaceutical company and I'm doing a lot of like analysis, lab tests, etc., and then something goes wrong, right? You want to make sure that when you go and check the results of the test, the one company is not able to manipulate the database in order to say, hey, look, I did the test, everything was fine. Actually, it's not. And so actually using a blockchain as a mechanism of like recording verifiable proofs of the results of some labs without actually ever disclosing the results. You're just disclosing the proof that the results have been done. And then ex post, you can go, and when necessary, you can go and verify, and you can always compare with what was recorded so that you know for sure that no one has been manipulating the results. And this, I think, is actually extremely important, and one of the very valuable contributions that blockchain technology can bring into this space. And then finally, to go into the DAOs. So I think the DAOs is one very interesting thing to explore. How do we create those governance around common goods, right? And again, like the governance of the commons, right? Those are things that we've been exploring those questions. And but the governance of the commons always requires some kind of institutional framework in order to ensure that there is monitoring, in order to ensure that there is a system for enforcement and sanctioning and so forth. And all of a sudden, when we actually adopt a DAO-based infrastructure, we actually can create a more distributed common-based governance structure. And again, that's not enough to just use a DAO, because you can also use a DAO with a very centralized governance structure or with a very plutocratic governance structure, and that's not going to help anything. So the technology itself is not the solution. The way in which we can actually design specific governance structures on top of this technology is actually what can really bring a change. And once again, I think, like, especially when we apply these towards the context of like research and like all those type of research that require extensive investments and cannot be done. Like Wikipedia is an easy one, because Wikipedia, you just need to like do some edits and you just need a server, right? But how do you actually transpose the Wikipedia model in a system in which you actually need extensive investment? And somehow this needs to come with some kind of either reward system or at least attribution, accreditation, attestation system that is much more sophisticated than Wikipedia. Also because you don't want bad data into that system either, right? And so that's where it's, while the internet, as you said, Jeremy, the internet enabled these new types of distributed and global collaboration, and that was like open source and Wikipedia and all these things. When we move into DeSci, it's not enough. There needs to be confidence. There needs to be mechanism of verifiability. There needs to be mechanisms that enable the counting of who has brought which value, and potentially the reward according, whether it's governance reward, whether it's financial reward, whatever we decide it to be. But you know, if there is an investment that comes in, there needs to be a reason for doing these investments that rewards the people that contribute resources. And so all of a sudden, the DAO is, to me, the scalability mechanism for bringing this model that has worked really well for the digital commons, because the digital commons have this magic particularity of being digital and very easy and cheap to reproduce, and move it into those more fundamental question, which is like environmental issue that require tangible intervention in the real world, research, labs, and so forth. And that's where the DAOification of those global communities and distributed networks can support this transition and can actually attract people to also engage in these things where it requires maybe a higher barrier to entry to contribute.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm just mindful that we have 4 minutes left. So Jeremy, I want to open up the chance for you to, you know, if you have any thoughts to follow up on what Primavera said, if you'd like to speak on that.
Well, thanks. That's really generous. And I do, as a matter of fact. And, you know, I'd like to link to one of the questions in the chat, which says, you know, does the COVID pandemic show the need for more centralization or more decentralization? And that's the first part of the question. So I'll just pick up that for a second. When I went to Guinea in 2014 as a part of the WHO Ebola response, WHO was learning. We were having a learning moment. The learning moment was that epidemic response to potential pandemic of the lethality and gravity of Ebola. It's not sending in the fire brigade, the epidemiologists, the contact tracers and stuff like that. It is actually an all of society initiative. And, so what people were learning, in a slow way, maybe too little too late, but they got there actually, was that you needed to involve families, schools, football clubs, associations, benevolent associations, church groups, and every other kind of structure that we use in human society. That we are not monads, and we have to work through those structures. And what do those structures do? Well, I mean, they do a lot of what Primavera is talking about, is that they do credentialing. They certification of membership and affiliation. They also kind of like represent the common values of those, memberships and affiliations. But for certain, in the knowledge space and in the policy space, we need some kind of, like what happened in COVID is, we have a lot of policymakers that are like writing for Breitbart or, Alex Jones and stuff like that, that are like actually more effective policymakers than the people that have the knowledge about the policy, right? So that's a certification problem. That's a immutable ledger problem. That's a zero knowledge proof problem. How do you know that they know? And in fact, we didn't, we just had a complete free-for-all. So I think where we fell down with COVID policy was that we didn't have the kind of like structures, Joe and Mildred blogs or something like that, wherever they may be living, in whichever community in the middle part of, not too educated, but not, completely uneducated, and, not too rich, but not too poor. We couldn't reach that median person, right? The person that the RCTs that we design are actually telling us how to treat the median person. We couldn't reach that median person's brain with knowledge. And because we didn't have some of these credentialing and certification and immutable ledgers and registries and zero knowledge proofs and all these other mechanisms that we can have now. So COVID policy was treated, like in the UK, it was treated as though I'm talking to you as individuals, stay home. Nobody talked to us as families, as football clubs, as sport teams, as, whatever, our painting societies. Nobody talked to us in our collectivities, and our collectivities ceased to operate. So I think that, linking to with the question, COVID policy fell down by not having, so I hope that we get there soon, with the kind of things that you're talking about, Primavera. I think those are really important.
Thank you, Jeremy, and for answering one of the questions as well. I think this is a lot to think about, and I think this is a perfect way to wrap up our wonderful third session. And I'd firstly like to thank Carmody, Jeremy, Primavera for sharing your thoughts. And I think it was such a rich discussion. Just sitting there and listening to you guys, and I feel like there's so much more you could talk about, which is quite special, especially in such an amazing field for with so much potential to do good, which is really exciting. So I hope to see, I also have dreams that this can be a change, and this is something that can help a lot more people. So I'd really like to thank everyone for listening as well and for tuning in. And I want to remind everyone our in-person event is happening this weekend, and it'll be really exciting, and it'll be another opportunity to have more of these discussions. I also stay tuned and look out for the next and final fourth edition of this session of Unlikely Conversations, where we'll actually be discussing more of applications and use cases of this type of technology to help reach those people, to help facilitate and not make the same mistakes we did, for example, during the management of COVID. So again, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Srivatsan. Thank you, Primavera. Great
Thank
to
you.
learn
Bye,
from you
everyone.
both.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.